If you want to learn how to build great web APIs, then stay tuned. You want to develop too? So in the last video we installed some extra things and made our first small Slim app. It was a little one route thingy which actually responded to the root path of our application, which is this thing here, and we registered it by using the get method of our app instance. Then we wrote something into the response stream, in this case hello world, but now we're going to see more complex examples. As you might have already guessed, we can easily register more routes like post routes by just calling post. So we're using our app instance, calling the post function, and we are going to specify a new path like users. Next, we are creating another closure function with the same signature as above, because it's basically pretty much the same. Next thing is we're going to output some things here as well. And in the next step we're going to see a little different way of registering routes. So far we've only used closure functions to register new routes, but as you may imagine, in a later scenario when we got like 20, 50 or even 100 routes, this will bloat up our code. So before we continue, like this in the end means adding more and more, we're going to actually separate those routes into another file. Usually this is done in another file inside the config folder. So go ahead and create a new folder called config, and inside that folder create a new file called routes.php. So to actually export those routes into this routes file, we need to first declare our normal PHP file, and then we can return an anonymous function which will actually take our app as a parameter. To use that, sure, we need to import our app class or the Slim app class, and now everything we need to do is basically take those routes from here, put it over into the new file, and call that file in the index.php. But first there are still some things missing, which are basically our response and request declarations, so that they can be used inside those parameters here. So right now these routes won't work anymore because we're not calling the actual routes.php file. So we are going to do that now. We are calling require once or require and choosing the correct directory, which is inside the config folder. So we're going to specify dir, going one directory up into the config file or config folder, and then calling that routes.php file. But in this case we're actually going to do it a bit different, because we're actually importing a function. So for this special case where we only have a few routes or separate out like 10, 20 routes, this is pretty much okay. But maybe in a later video we're going to use a bit different approach, because it would be easier if we could actually say like customer routes or billing routes or whatever is in your mind. So we may change that later, but for now it's okay. Now let me just quick fix this little bug over here, and now we can actually think about like grouping routes, because you don't want to repeatedly type users and over again. And in the next step it would be interesting to like say, okay, we're gonna group this routes here called users to create, update profile, whatever. And it would be nice to actually be able to say like, okay, I'm gonna protect this route with this specific authorization style and so on. So it would be really nice to like group things, and this is possible. Grouping routes is pretty much easy, as you can just say app and then call the group method. In this group method you can specify different parameters. The first is the good old starting slug inside the URL, like above, for example, users. And now you can actually additionally specify something like an ID if you want to say like, okay, for a user with a specific ID, now I'm going to specify like a get route, a delete route, or a put patch route, etc. The second parameter of this group function is another function with an app as parameter. So now we have the chance to actually create subroutes by just using it like this. In this style we now have a subroute of users, but right now it wouldn't make much sense, so we're going to specify an argument. So if we call users/5 for example, then this would get mapped to this new get route. We could for example say over here /details, so get the details for user 5, but this isn't really necessary because in CRUD operations and in combination with the REST standard, I think, or it mostly is like this, that you just say, okay, it's an empty get. That means we are registering a get function callback, so to say, on users/ID as parameter. So in the end, we are just going to specify the last few parameters to complete this over here. So next thing is response, and the last thing is args for arguments. To access this ID from the args associative array, we can just go as usual and say like ID equals args and then choosing ID as the key. Sure, you can run into a few problems, like if there's a name specified instead of an actual integer or a number, and another problem could be that this ID isn't even like specified. So this depends on how you wrote this expression over here. So I can show you another way of guaranteeing that this is actually a number. The first step could be to check like if ID is inside that associative array, and this could be done like array key access is one possible function. If this array key exists, means if ID exists inside args, then continue processing the request. But there is another better way, in my opinion, at least for some cases, using regular expressions. In the current case, I would prefer to use like if this array does not contain the ID, then I would use like a short return, an early return to send back like HTTP code 400 bad request. But okay, we have this easier way with expressions, regular expressions. So let me show you an example for that. I'm not a big regular expression pro, but I think this will already help. So we can now say like ID is something like a number from 0 to 9, and not only one number or digit, it's actually one or more. So adding that plus will now guarantee that you get a number from 0 to 9, or consisting of digits from 0 to 9, which can be like 1 or 12 or 1230. You know what I mean. Now there's only one missing piece, means converting that ID to an actual number, because it comes in as a string. So convert it like int val or anything other you like to use as a converting function. So now we got our ID ready to go, and we can like fetch this user from the database, or yeah, pretty much handle that. And then there's something called setName. It's a function which helps you naming routes, obviously. And this can be helpful if you want to like generate a specific URL and return it to the client. To set a name for the route, just go after your definition. The get function will return a route instance, so you can call setName on that. And for example, say user details. There are other things like grouping or nesting separate segments of a route, so you can like specify an optional path of the route, but I think this is currently too much for the current point, so I think we skip this for now. Until now, we've only used closure functions or anonymous functions to register routes. As you can see in the background, there are more options registering routes, which can come in handy in different situations. For example, you can provide a container key, and with a colon, I think it's in English, you can use the method name. So you have to go like this, call the app instance and the get function on that instance, provide a path like every time, and then you can go ahead and use like container key colon method. Container key means a key of your dependency injection container, which we will also cover in a later tutorial, but for now I think this is pretty much enough. Another example could be like a class colon method, or a class simply implementing a public function called underscore underscore invoke. Yeah, I think this is pretty much it for this, and yeah, thanks for watching, and I see you in the next episode.